The Arizona sun beat mercilessly on the dusty parade ground of Fort Verde. It was noon on a summer day in 1881, and the heat was so intense it distorted the air, making the fort's wooden buildings seem to ripple like mirages in the desert. In the center of that parade ground, exposed to the brutal sun with no shade whatsoever, stood a small wooden structure approximately 6 feet square. The soldiers called it the hot box, and at that moment, inside that wooden furnace, a woman was dying. Lieutenant Davies spat in the dust at his feet, his blue eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Corporal Elias Holt of the 10th Cavalry Regiment, one of the famous buffalo soldiers. "She will not get one single drop of water," Davies commanded, his voice cutting through the dry air like a knife. "She'll talk, or she'll dry up. That is a final order, Corporal." Davies turned and walked back toward the officers' quarters, where fresh water awaited him in ceramic pitchers kept in the shade. His footsteps raised small clouds of red dust that settled slowly in the still air. Corporal Elias Holt remained at his sentry position beside the punishment box. At 28 years old, he had the bearing of a veteran soldier, broad shoulders, straight back, calloused hands that had held reins and rifles for years. His skin was dark as ebony, his blue wool uniform stained with sweat under the relentless sun. Inside that box, huddled and nearly unconscious from heat exceeding 110 degrees, was Taz-I Slet, a young Chiricahua Apache woman of approximately 22 years. She had been captured 3 days earlier during an ambush in the Dragoon Mountains. Holt now faced an impossible choice: obey the cruel, direct order of a white officer he despised, or save the life of an enemy woman he was supposed to hate. What happened in the next few hours was an act of defiance that would shatter the boundaries between war, race, and loyalty. This is the forgotten story of what happens when two oppressed worlds collide, and the true meaning of humanity is revealed in the most unlikely of places. Before we dive into this incredible moment, if you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It truly helps. The Forgotten Hearts continue bringing these lost stories back to life. To understand the weight of that day in 1881, you first have to understand the two people at its center, and you must understand the propaganda that ruled their lives. For Taz-I Slet, the propaganda was not a government poster. It was her lived, breathed, and blood-soaked reality. She was a Chiricahua Apache, one of the most feared and respected peoples of the Southwest. In her world, the American soldier was not a man. He was a monster. They called them Pindaliko Yai, the White Eyes, ghost-skinned demons who spoke in lies and killed without honor. This was not abstract prejudice or political propaganda. It was knowledge built upon the bones of her own family. Taz-I Slet was still a child of 8 when the Americans first came to her village. She remembered the day with painful clarity. The soldiers had arrived under a white flag, promising peace, promising negotiations. Her uncle, a respected man named Mangas Coloradas, had agreed to meet with them. He believed their promises. He believed peace was possible. She remembered playing near the bushes when she saw the soldiers surround her uncle. Without warning, without provocation, they arrested him. His hands were tied behind his back as he shouted in protest. She watched, hidden and terrified, as they took him away. Her uncle never returned. Months later, they learned he had been tortured and murdered while in protective army custody. His body was decapitated and his head sent east as a medical trophy to be studied. That was the first betrayal. It would not be the last. When she was 15, she survived the massacre at Tres Castillos in Mexico. Mexican and American soldiers had surrounded her people's camp at dawn. There was no warning, no chance for surrender. It was simply slaughter. Tazai survived not by fighting, but by hiding. When the shooting began, she dove to the ground and crawled beneath the bodies of her cousins who had fallen. She lay there, covered in blood that wasn't hers, barely daring to breathe, as she heard soldiers ride past on horseback. Some of them were laughing as they trampled over the dead. She remained under those bodies for hours, long after the sounds of gunfire and screaming had ceased. When she finally crawled out, the sun was already setting. The camp was a graveyard. Women, children, elders, all dead. The soldiers had taken anything of value and left the bodies for the vultures. That night, covered in dried blood and shaking with trauma, Tazai made an oath. She would never trust the white eyes again. She would fight. She would resist. And if they came for her, she would take them with her. So her hatred was not a choice. It was a scar, earned through a lifetime of watching her people be hunted, betrayed, and massacred. In the following years, she joined her tribe's warriors in raids against American settlements. She learned to shoot, to ride, to survive in the unforgiving desert. She became part of the band of a rising warrior leader named Geronimo, a man whose own family had been massacred by the Mexicans and who vowed never to surrender to the Americans. So when her band was ambushed in the Dragoon Mountains in October 1881, she fought. She fought until her hands were raw and her knife was broken. But she was overwhelmed. 6 soldiers surrounded her. She expected to be killed right there. In Apache culture, dying in battle was honorable. Being captured was a shame worse than death. But they didn't kill her. They bound her and dragged her back to the American fort. As her horse carried her through the desert, she expected cruelty. She expected death. It was all she had ever known from them. But then she saw him, the soldier who bound her wrists, the man who pushed her onto the horse. He wore the blue coat of the White Eye, but he was not a White Eye. His skin was dark, darker than her own, darker than anyone she had ever seen. She froze. The shock was so profound it was almost religious. In the entire Apache cosmology, there was no category for this man. He was an impossibility. He wore the uniform of the oppressor, but he didn't look like the oppressor. She was terrified, but for the first time, she was also confused. This confusion was the first crack in the wall of her hatred. Who or what was this man? That man was Corporal Elias Holt, and his propaganda was the broken promise of America. Holt had been born into slavery on a rice plantation in South Carolina in 1853. His first memory wasn't of his mother, or a toy, or a lullaby. It was the sound of a bell at 4 a.m, that bell that called the slaves to the fields before the sun rose. His first life lesson was that the white man's word was law, and that his skin color was a sin that required a lifetime of forced labor to atone for. He was 7 years old when he felt the cut of the overseer's whip for the first time. His crime. Making direct eye contact with the plantation master. In 1860s South Carolina, a black boy who looked a white man in the eye was being insolent and needed to be corrected. He watched his mother, her hands bleeding from the harvest, be sold when he was 10 years old. Her crime? Insolence. She had asked if she could visit her youngest son who worked on another plantation 15 miles away. Elias never saw her again. When the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, Holt was 12 years old. He wasn't just freed, he was reborn. Freedom was physical, yes, but more than that, it was psychological. For the first time in his life, he was legally a person, not property. But freedom without opportunity is just a different form of prison. In the chaotic years of Reconstruction in the South, newly freed black men faced violence from white terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They were denied work, denied land, denied education. Freedom was real on paper, but illusory in practice. So in 1875, at 22 years old, Elias Holt made a decision that would change his life. He enlisted in the United States Army. He did it for the same reason thousands of other black men did. He wanted to prove his manhood. He wanted to earn his citizenship. He wanted the dignity and equality that America had always denied him. He wanted to wear a uniform, carry a rifle, and be recognized as a man equal to the white soldiers he saw marching through the streets. He was assigned to the 10th Cavalry Regiment, one of the new colored cavalry units created by Congress after the Civil War. These units were composed entirely of black soldiers, commanded primarily by white officers. They were sent to the hardest, most violent, most desolate corners of the country, the American West. The Native Americans called them buffalo soldiers because their hair resembled the curly fur of the buffalo, and because they fought with the ferocity of that great plains beast. Holt had fought in the Civil War as a young recruit. He had participated in campaigns against the Comanches in West Texas. He had ridden patrols through Kansas in brutal winters. Now, he was stationed in the godless inferno of the Arizona Territory, fighting the Apaches, and he was commanded by men, like Lieutenant Davies. But the reality of his service was a bitter pill. The promise was a lie. Holt learned quickly that the blue uniform didn't make him equal. It only made him a target from both sides. The buffalo soldiers were sent to the hardest, most violent, most desolate posts in the country. They ate worse food, rode lamer horses, and used older rifles than any of the white regiments. At Fort Verde, the white soldiers had fresh water brought from a deep well. The buffalo soldiers had to collect water from a muddy river 3 miles away. The white soldiers ate canned meat and preserved vegetables. The buffalo soldiers ate moldy hardtack and beans. And above all, they were commanded by officers who saw them not as equals, but as tools. Mules, useful, but disposable. Lieutenant George Davies was the perfect example. He was not a villain in his own mind. He was the hero of his own story. He was a man from Ohio who believed in two things with religious certainty: manifest destiny, the manifest destiny of the white race to rule America from coast to coast, and the absolute natural inferiority of any man who wasn't white. To him, the Apaches were savages, a plague to be eliminated, an obstacle to progress and civilization. They were subhuman, creatures who didn't deserve mercy or negotiation, only subjugation or extermination. And his own black soldiers, they were mules. In his eyes, they were strong, reliable, and useful tools for doing the dirty work that a white man shouldn't have to do. They were, in his estimation, a step above the savage, but 1,000 steps below him. He commanded them, but he didn't respect them. He saw their dark skin as a mark of an inferior, controllable caste, born to serve. This explosive mix of hatred, duty, and buried trauma all converged on that scalding patch of dust at Fort Verde in October 1881. Lieutenant Davies wanted information. He believed Tazai Slet's band, led by the rising warrior leader Geronimo, was hiding in a stronghold to the south, and he was willing to do anything to get the location. "She is an Apache," he told Holt, a sneer on his face. "They are tougher than snakes, but even a snake needs water. We will break her." And so, Tazai Slet was thrown into the hot box. It was a 6-foot by 6-foot wooden cell with no windows and only a small slot in the door. It sat in the middle of the parade ground, under the full, murderous, unfiltered blaze of the Arizona sun. The first day was brutal. Tazai Slet remained silent, her eyes burning with a defiance that matched the sun. Corporal Holt stood his post, 8 hours on, 4 hours off. He was a professional. He followed orders. It was the only way to survive, the only way to advance. He tried to rationalize it. She was the enemy. She had likely killed settlers, perhaps even soldiers. This was war. War was ugly. But that night, when the desert temperature plummeted, he could hear her through the wood. She wasn't wailing or crying. She was chanting, a low, rhythmic prayer to her gods. It was a sound that unnerved him. It was not the sound of a savage. It was the sound of a human being in the dark, calling for her ancestors. The temperature inside the box during the day easily reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was suffocating, thick as hot wool. There was no circulation. The wood absorbed the heat and radiated it back. It was like being inside an oven. The second day, the heat became unbearable. By midday, her chanting had stopped. Holt stood his post, the sun beating down on his own wool uniform. His skin was slick with sweat. He was allowed a canteen. She was not. He tried not to look at the box. He tried to think of his pay, of the small plot of land he hoped to buy in Illinois, of anything but the woman inside. But then he started to hear a new sound, a faint, low moan, a rasping. It was the sound of a human being in agony, and it was a sound Holt knew intimately. He was no longer in Arizona. He was back in South Carolina. He was a child, hiding behind a rain barrel, watching the overseer. A field hand, a friend of his father's named Moses, had been tied to a post for trying to run. He was left in the sun, denied water for 2 days, to make an example. Holt remembered the sound Moses made on that second day. The same dry, gasping moan, the sound of a man's spirit being broken by thirst just before his body gave out. Moses died on the third day. His body was left tied to the post for 1 more day as a warning. Holt was 9 years old when he saw it. He never forgot. Now 20 years later, he was hearing that same sound again. He had seen this exact kind of cruelty. Not on a battlefield, but on the plantation. He had seen it used as a tool of torture to break a man's will. This wasn't war. This was an overseer's punishment. This was slavery. He looked at the box. And in his mind, he was no longer guarding an Apache savage. He was guarding Moses. He was guarding his own mother, her lips cracked and bleeding after a 16-hour day in the fields. His entire body tensed. He had joined the army to escape this. He had joined to fight against this kind of inhumanity. And here he was, in a blue uniform, on the other side of the whip. He had become the man he had always hated. That evening, Lieutenant Davies rode by on his horse. He didn't dismount. He looked down at Holt, amused. "Still alive in there, Corporal?" he sneered. Holt's jaw tightened. "She is silent, sir." "Good. Let her be. Don't you get any soft ideas, Holt," Davies warned, pointing a gloved finger. "I know your kind can be emotional. You give her 1 drop and I'll have you in chains before sundown. Your duty is to this fort, not to that thing. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Holt replied, his voice hollow, his eyes fixed on the dust. Davies rode back to the officers' quarters, to a cool drink and a hot meal served by black soldiers ordered to attend him. Night fell. The desert air turned cold, but the cell offered no relief. By the morning of the third day, the sounds from the box had stopped completely. Holt felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He had seen death in combat. He knew its silence. She was dying. He stood there for another hour, his conscience at war with his training. He had pledged an oath to the United States. But to what, exactly? To the flag, the Constitution, or to the whims of a cruel man like Davies? He thought of the flag he had pledged to serve, the one that promised liberty and justice for all. Then he looked at the box, a 6-by-6-foot monument to that lie. That was his moment, the breaking point. He made his choice. He looked across the parade ground. Lieutenant Davies was in the officers' mess, his laughter carrying on the morning air. The rest of the fort was quiet, caught in the early morning lull. This was his moment. He knew the cost, his career, his freedom, his life. Slowly, deliberately, he unhooked his own canteen. The metal was already warm from the morning sun. It held his own ration of water for the next 8 hours. He looked left. He looked right. No one was watching. He knelt at the slot in the cell door. "Ma'am," he whispered. No answer. "Ma'am," he said, louder. He shook the canteen so she could hear the water sloshing. "Water. Drink." He heard a faint scrape from inside, the sound of a body dragging itself across the wooden floor. A hand, weak and trembling, fumbled out of the slot. Her fingers were raw. He pushed the mouth of the canteen toward her. He felt her take it. He heard the sound of desperate, gasping swallows, a sound that was half drown, half sob. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more forgotten tales, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Forgotten Hearts. What part of this story stood out to you the most? Let me know in the comments below.